My name is Audrey, 33 years old, and I work as an investment portfolio manager. Everything at my best friend Claire's baby shower seemed picture perfect until my husband Nolan grabbed my wrist. "We have to leave right now," he whispered, his face completely pale. I asked him what was wrong. He did not say a single word as he dragged me out of the luxurious suburban home. We reached our car and locked the doors. He turned to me and asked how I could possibly not notice what was happening right in front of me. What he showed me next made my stomach drop and shattered my entire existence in an instant. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth. We were sitting in the driveway of Claire's immaculate estate. I was still clutching the expensive gift I had bought for her baby. Claire and I had been best friends for 15 years. I trusted her with my life. Nolan pulled out his phone. His hands were shaking. He works as a data auditor and cybersecurity expert, so he notices details that everyone else misses. He pulled up a photo he had discreetly taken inside the house. Claire had been using her tablet to project ultrasound photos onto the large television screen in the living room for all the guests to admire. For a brief second, a notification banner had dropped down from the top of her screen. Everyone else was busy cheering and drinking champagne, but Nolan saw it. He snapped a quick picture before it disappeared. "Look at the sender, and look at the amount," Nolan said, his voice tense. I squinted at the bright screen. The notification was a bank alert for an incoming wire transfer. The sender was listed as Richard and Cynthia, my parents. The amount was a staggering $250,000. But it was the memo line that made all the blood drain from my face. The text read, "For Brandon Jr.'s care." I stared at the glowing screen. Brandon is my older brother. He is the undisputed golden child of our family, a man who has never held a steady job and constantly relies on our parents to bail him out of his terrible business ventures. The baby Claire was carrying was not her husband's child. It was Brandon's child. My best friend had been sleeping with my deadbeat brother, and my parents were secretly funneling $250,000 into her bank account to fund their golden boy's illegitimate baby. A sick feeling washed over me as the absolute reality of the situation set in. My parents had just handed over $250,000 in liquid cash without blinking an eye. I sat there in the passenger seat, and suddenly I was 18 years old again, sitting at my parents' dining room table, begging them for help with my college tuition. I had been accepted into a top-tier university to study finance. My parents had looked me directly in the eyes and claimed they were completely bankrupt. My father, Richard, had sighed heavily and told me I needed to learn the value of hard work, forcing me to take out massive student loans and work 3 jobs just to survive. Yet that very same week, they had purchased a brand new sports car for Brandon, just because he managed to pass his community college classes. They had always treated me like a financial burden while treating Brandon like absolute royalty. The betrayal was so deep, it felt like physical pain. My best friend had betrayed me by sleeping with my brother. My parents had betrayed me by secretly funding her life while constantly telling me I was selfish for focusing on my career. I had spent years building my wealth from nothing, eventually becoming a highly successful portfolio manager. I even created a shadow company to buy up toxic corporate debt, securing my own financial independence because I knew my family would never support me. They always told me I was the cold and calculating one. They said my career isolated me. In reality, they were the ones operating a web of lies right under my nose. Nolan gently took the gift box out of my hands. I had not realized how tightly I was gripping it. The cardboard corners were crushed under the pressure of my fingers. He looked at me with deep concern in his eyes. "What do you want to do, Audrey?" he asked softly. "Do you want to go back inside and confront them right now?" I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, forcing the tears back down. Crying would give them power. Crying was exactly what my mother Cynthia expected me to do so she could call me dramatic and unstable. I needed to be smart. I needed to be the cold and calculating portfolio manager they always accused me of being. I looked at Nolan and told him to start the car. We were going to leave quietly, and let them enjoy their fake celebration. We needed time to gather evidence before we tore their perfect facade to the ground. Nolan nodded and reached for the ignition. But before he could start the engine, a loud violent pounding hit my passenger side window. I jumped in my seat. Standing right outside the car was my mother, Cynthia. Her face was flushed with red anger and she was glaring at me through the glass. In her manicured hand, she was clutching a crumpled piece of paper. She yanked the car door handle, but Nolan had locked it. "Roll down the window right now, Audrey," she demanded loudly. I lowered the window just enough to hear her voice. She violently shoved the paper inside. It was the massive catering bill. The crumpled piece of paper landed directly on my lap with a soft thud. I stared down at the bold printed logo of Platinum Catering, followed by an elaborate itemized list of caviar appetizers, vintage champagne, and a towering custom baby shower cake. At the very bottom of the page, the total due glowed in heavy black ink: $15,000. I looked up at my mother through the partially opened car window. Her perfectly highlighted hair was slightly windblown and her eyes were manic with a frantic, entitled energy that I knew all too well. "Hand over your Amex!" "Audrey?" Cynthia snapped. She tapped her French manicured fingernails impatiently against the cold glass edge of my window. "The caterers are threatening to pack up the entire dessert station if the balance is not settled right this second. Your father and I left our wallets at home." "You left your wallets at home," I repeated. My voice was dangerously calm, barely masking the sheer disbelief vibrating through my entire body. "You came to a lavish baby shower that you supposedly hosted for your daughter-in-law, and you conveniently forgot your wallets." Cynthia rolled her eyes and let out a dramatic, exasperated sigh. "Do not start with your endless interrogations, Audrey. We have a massive amount on our plate right now. Brandon is in the middle of launching his new crypto consulting firm, and he desperately needed our liquid capital for his initial investment round. You manage millions of dollars in corporate portfolios every single day. $15,000 is literal pocket change to you. Do not be stingy with your own family when we are in a bind." I looked at the woman who had given birth to me, feeling a sickening wave of disgust. The sheer audacity of her demand was breathtaking. My brother Brandon was 35 years old. This crypto consulting firm was his sixth major business venture in 5 short years. Before this, it was an artisan dog food bakery, a luxury sneaker brand, and a failed mobile app for rating golf courses. Every single time he had a brilliant new idea, my parents completely funded his delusions. Every single time, the money vanished into thin air. Yet when I was 18 years old and received an acceptance letter to a prestigious Ivy League university, Cynthia had sat me down at our mahogany kitchen table and told me I was incredibly selfish for expecting them to pay my tuition. She told me I needed to pull myself up by my bootstraps and learn the true value of a dollar. I spent the next decade drowning in suffocating student debt, working nights and weekends to build my career from the ground up, while they bought Brandon a luxury condo simply because renting was beneath his status. And now she wanted me to casually hand over $15,000 for a baby shower celebrating Brandon's secret affair with my best friend. I picked up the catering bill by the corner, holding it as if it were contaminated, and firmly handed it back through the crack in the window. "This is not my bill, Mom," I said, keeping my gaze locked onto hers. "And this is certainly not my financial burden to bear. If you and Dad want to fund a party for Claire, you can figure out how to pay for it yourselves." Cynthia's face twisted into an ugly, unrecognizable snarl. She tried to shove the heavy paper back into the car, but I held my ground, refusing to take it. "You are absolutely unbelievable," she hissed. Her voice was rising loud enough for the valet parking attendants to turn and stare at our vehicle. "Your brother is building an empire. He needs our unconditional support. You have a fundamental duty to help this family when we ask. I am asking for one simple favor." "No, you are demanding that I subsidize your lies?" I shot back, gripping the leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. "You are paying Claire to keep her quiet about Brandon's child, and now you want me to pay for the catering to keep up your perfect suburban appearances. I am completely done being your backup bank account, Cynthia." I did not wait for her response. I pressed the button to roll up the window. Cynthia shrieked and snatched her fingers back just a split second before the tinted glass sealed shut. I hit the central locking button with a loud, satisfying click, shifted the car into reverse, and pressed my foot down on the gas pedal. Through the rearview mirror, I watched my mother standing alone in the middle of the sprawling circular driveway. She was screaming words I could no longer hear, her face, bright red, frantically waving the catering bill in the air like a weapon. Nolan placed a comforting, warm hand on my knee as we pulled out of the wrought iron gates and merged onto the main road. We drove home in a heavy, suffocating silence. The adrenaline was slowly wearing off, leaving behind a cold, hard knot of profound anger in my chest. I had spent my entire adult life trying to prove my worth to people who only ever saw me as a convenient financial safety net for their golden boy. I realized then that my parents did not just heavily favor Brandon. They actively despised my independence because they could not control it or manipulate it for their own gain. The night passed in a blur of restless pacing and hushed conversations. Nolan and I stayed up late piecing together the timeline of Brandon and Claire's affair, realizing the glaring signs had been there for months. The sudden expensive lunches Claire was taking, the mysterious weekend trips Brandon claimed were for critical business meetings, my parents suddenly treating Claire like absolute royalty. It was a perfectly orchestrated web of deceit, and I had been the blind fool caught right in the middle of it. I finally managed to get a few restless hours of sleep before my alarm woke me at exactly 6 in the morning. I had a major client portfolio review at 9, and I needed to bury my overwhelming emotions and function like the professional I was trained to be. I arrived at my office in downtown Hartford, poured myself a large cup of black coffee, and opened my laptop. The panoramic view of the city skyline usually grounded my thoughts, but today my mind was racing with defensive strategies. I needed to isolate my finances completely. I needed to ensure my parents had absolutely zero access to any of my accounts, trusts, or assets. At exactly 8:45, I was reviewing a dense quarterly earnings report when my personal cell phone vibrated violently against the mahogany desk. I glanced at the glowing screen. It was an automated text message from American Express, marked with a bright red, urgent fraud alert icon. I picked up the phone, my brow furrowing in deep confusion. The digital message was exceptionally clear and direct. Did you authorize a charge of $15,000 to Platinum Catering at 8:42 a.m.? Reply yes or no. My heart slammed against my ribs, echoing in my ears. I reached into my purse. My physical credit card was safely tucked inside my leather wallet. I had not authorized anything. Someone had stolen my private card details. Someone in my family had just successfully stolen $15,000 from me. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, the glaring red fraud alert burning into my retinas. $15,000. It was the exact amount of the catering bill my mother had violently shoved at my car window yesterday. My chest tightened, but I did not shed a single tear. Crying was a useless biological response. Crying was what Cynthia expected me to do. Instead, a wave of absolute freezing clarity washed over my brain. I slid my phone across the smooth mahogany surface of my desk toward Nolan. He had just walked into my home office holding 2 mugs of black coffee. He set the mugs down carefully, his eyes narrowing as he read the automated message from American Express. He did not ask any pointless questions. We had been married long enough for him to know exactly how my mind worked. Nolan simply turned around, walked down the hallway to his own office, and returned carrying his heavily encrypted work laptop. As a senior data auditor and cybersecurity specialist, tracking digital footprints was not just his job. It was his absolute obsession. He cracked his knuckles, opened the terminal on his screen, and went straight to work. We sat in total silence for 20 minutes. The only sound in the room was the rapid, rhythmic clicking of his fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard. I logged into my banking portal and froze the compromised account immediately. Then I watched Nolan work. He was bypassing the basic banking interface, pulling the raw transaction data directly from the vendor payment gateway. He cross-referenced the timestamp of the charge, which was exactly 8:42 this morning. He traced the specific Internet Protocol address, attached to the digital invoice payment. I leaned over his shoulder, watching lines of code reflect in his glasses. The payment was not processed from my parents' house. It was not processed from Claire's suburban estate. The charge originated from a cellular network. Nolan ran a quick diagnostic trace on the device identifier. A small gray box popped up on his screen displaying the device name. It read Sabrina's iPhone 14 Pro Max. My younger sister, Sabrina. The 30-year-old woman who spent her entire existence curating a fake life of luxury on social media. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together in my mind. During the baby shower yesterday, I had left my designer handbag sitting on a velvet chair in the living room for exactly 4 minutes while I used the guest restroom. Sabrina had been sitting right next to it. She had always been insanely jealous of my financial success. She must have slipped her perfectly manicured hand into my purse, taken a quick photograph of my platinum card, and put it right back. She used my hard-earned money to pay the caterer this morning so she could play the generous, wealthy aunt and impress Claire and my parents. It was disgusting, but it was not surprising. Sabrina had been stealing from me since we were teenagers. I remembered being 16 years old and saving my allowance for 3 entire months to buy a vintage cashmere sweater. I wore it once. The next week, Sabrina wore it to a high school party and ruined it by spilling cheap wine all over the front. When I confronted her, Cynthia had immediately stepped in, shielding Sabrina and yelling at me for being ungenerous. Sisters share. Audrey Cynthia had scolded me. Do not be so materialistic. My parents had trained Sabrina to believe that what was mine was automatically hers, but stealing a sweater was one thing. Stealing $15,000 was grand larceny. Nolan did not stop typing. His jaw was set in a tight, rigid line. If she felt comfortable enough to steal this card, he muttered, his eyes scanning a new set of databases. We need to see what else she has been doing. Give me your social security number again. I recited the 9 digits. Nolan ran a comprehensive deep audit of my entire credit history, utilizing back channels and dark web monitoring tools that standard credit bureaus simply do not possess. What he found over the next 45 minutes made the $15,000 catering charge look like absolute pocket change. Sabrina had not just stolen my credit card yesterday. She had completely stolen my identity. Nolan pulled up 5 separate hidden credit accounts. There was a maxed-out card at a high-end luxury department store. There was a revolving line of credit at a premium cosmetic surgery clinic. There was even a secret lease agreement for a luxury vehicle. Sabrina had used my social security number, my stellar credit score, and a slightly altered version of my home address to fund her pathetic, hollow Instagram lifestyle. She was tens of thousands of dollars in debt, and my name was on every single document. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. My sister was a literal felon. She was actively destroying my financial reputation to buy designer shoes and chemical peels. Nolan slowly closed his laptop and looked up at me. His voice was completely serious. We need to call the police right now, Audrey. This is massive identity theft. I will print all the digital evidence. We can have her arrested before noon. I shook my head slowly. My eyes locked on the wall ahead of me. No, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. The police will just take a standard report. They will file paperwork. My father will hire a high-priced defense attorney to bail her out and spin a ridiculous story about a misunderstanding. I am not letting them control this narrative behind closed doors. I grabbed my car keys from the desk. It was exactly 10:30 on a Sunday morning. I knew exactly where my entire family was right now. Every single Sunday without fail, Richard and Cynthia hosted a lavish champagne brunch at their sprawling estate. It was a mandatory weekly performance where they gathered to drink expensive mimosas, congratulate themselves on their superiority, and tear down anyone who was not in the room. Brandon would be there gloating about his new baby. Sabrina would be there probably bragging about paying the catering bill. I marched out of my office down the hallway and straight to my car. Nolan grabbed his jacket and followed right behind me, his silent presence offering all the support I needed. The drive to the estate took 20 minutes. I broke the speed limit the entire way, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. When we arrived at the massive iron gates of my childhood home, I did not bother buzzing the intercom. I used my old access code to force the gates open. I parked my car directly on the pristine front lawn, ignoring the circular driveway entirely. I walked up the marble front steps, my heels echoing like gunshots against the stone. I did not knock. I reached out, grabbed the brass handles of the heavy double dining room doors, and kicked them wide open. The dining room doors crashed against the walls with a thunderous boom. The impact rattled the crystal pitchers and silver chafing dishes arranged on the long table. My mother Cynthia gasped sharply, clutching a white linen napkin to her chest. Richard paused with his fork hovering halfway to his mouth. Brandon sat completely frozen beside Claire, and there sitting directly across from her husband Jamal was Sabrina. She was holding a crystal flute of champagne, looking oblivious to the storm about to consume her perfect Sunday morning. I did not utter a single greeting. I marched to the head of the table, bypassing my mother's shocked face, and threw the thick stack of printed financial audits directly onto Sabrina's porcelain plate. The papers scattered violently across the table, knocking over her champagne and soaking the lace tablecloth. "What is your problem?" Sabrina shrieked. She jumped up as the alcohol splashed onto her silk dress. I pointed a steady finger directly at the scattered documents. "That is every single fraudulent credit application, unauthorized bank transfer, and forged signature you executed using my social security number. You did not just steal $15,000 for a catering bill yesterday. You completely stole my identity. You committed multiple federal felonies to fund your pathetic fake lifestyle." Sabrina did not attempt to deny the accusations. She instantly deployed her ultimate lifelong defense mechanism. The tears began flowing before I had even finished my sentence. Her lower lip quivered, and she collapsed back into her chair, burying her face in her hands and sobbing loudly. It was the exact same theatrical performance she used when she wrecked my car in high school to avoid punishment. Jamal sat perfectly still. He was a highly respected corporate attorney, a man who built his career and reputation on strict legal integrity and unwavering ethics. He reached out with a deliberate motion and pulled the soaked papers toward his side of the table. His dark eyes scanned the top sheet, then the second, reading the undeniable digital trail Nolan had spent the morning uncovering. He saw the IP addresses linking back to their home network, the altered billing addresses, and the forged signatures on the luxury car lease. I watched the color drain from Jamal's face. He looked at Sabrina, his wife, not with anger, but with absolute visceral disgust. "You committed wire fraud," Jamal said. His deep voice carried a terrifying quietness that cut through her fake sobbing. "You stole your own sister's identity to buy designer handbags and lease luxury cars. You are a felon, Sabrina." Sabrina cried even louder, reaching out a trembling hand to grab Jamal's arm, but he recoiled from her touch, as if she were carrying a highly contagious disease. He pushed his chair back, distancing himself from the woman he thought he knew. "That is enough," Richard bellowed. My father slammed his heavy fist onto the solid wood table with such force that the silverware jumped and clattered. He stood up, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. He pointed a thick, accusatory finger at me. "It is just money, Audrey," he yelled. "We are family. You make more than enough at your firm to cover this inconvenience. If you call the police on your sister, you will destroy her marriage and ruin her life over a few credit cards. You need to drop this immediately." I stared at him, my stomach twisting with a familiar, sickening realization. He was doing it again. He was rewriting reality to protect the guilty party and punish the victim, just because the guilty party was one of his favorites. I looked my father dead in the eyes, refusing to back down. Just like it was just a fender bender when Brandon drove drunk and crashed his truck into the neighbor's living room, I asked. My voice was laced with venom. I was 20 years old when that happened. I remembered Richard bribing the local police chief with a campaign donation and screaming at me for parking my car too close to the street. He had blamed my parking job for his golden boy's severe intoxication. You forced me to take the blame for the property damage so Brandon would not get a criminal record. You have always protected the criminals in this house while throwing me under the bus. Richard's eyes narrowed into dark slits. He marched around the large dining table and stopped mere inches from my face, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me. "You listened to me very carefully," he growled. His voice dropped to a menacing, gravelly pitch, meant to instill terror. "You are going to take these papers, you are going to walk out that front door, and you are going to forget this ever happened. If you dare bring the authorities into my home to arrest my daughter, I will personally see to it that you never work in the financial sector. I play golf with the board members of your investment firm. I know the managing directors at every major bank in this state. I will use every country club connection I possess to destroy your career, ruin your reputation, and blacklist you from the industry. Do you understand me?" The dining room held its collective breath. My mother looked smug, expecting me to fold under my father's aggressive threats, just like I always did when I was a child. Sabrina peeked through her fingers, waiting. Instead of cowering, a slow, icy smile spread across my face. I looked at the angry, arrogant man standing in front of me and felt nothing but absolute power. "I understand, Richard," I said, keeping my tone deadly calm. I reached into my leather tote bag and my fingers wrapped around the smooth plastic of a second, much thicker folder. I pulled it out and held it up for him to see. "But before you start making phone calls to ruin my career, we need to talk about yours." The folder I had just slammed onto the table was not just a collection of papers, it was a lethal weapon. I watched Richard's face as he glanced down at the documents. The color didn't just drain from his skin, it vanished entirely, leaving him looking like a gaunt, terrified ghost of the man who had been bellowing threats seconds ago. The papers were bank statements, not just the one Nolan had spotted on Claire's tablet, but the entire history of the wire transfers spanning the last 18 months. I had spent the last 2 weeks using my shadow company's resources to map every cent of that illicit funding. The trail was messy, chaotic, and utterly damning. It showed regular recurring payments from a family-run holding company, a company Richard used for his legitimate business, funneled directly into an offshore account held in Claire's maiden name. The memo lines which Cynthia and Richard had been so arrogant to include were consistent Brandon Jr.'s care. Brandon, who had been sitting at the end of the table looking smug and entitled, stood up and peered over Richard's shoulder. His face mirrored his father's shock. He looked at the paper, then back at me, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. You've been tracking these," Brandon stammered. His voice lacked any of the bravado he had possessed at the baby shower. "I don't just track assets, Brandon," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy tension in the dining room like a razor. "I audit them. I am a professional portfolio manager. Did you really think your pathetic amateur attempt at financial secrecy would hold up against someone who spends every waking hour hunting for hidden liabilities?" Cynthia's frantic, entitled energy vanished. She slumped back into her chair, her hand trembling as she reached for her half-empty mimosa. The room had become deathly quiet. Even the valet attendants outside seemed to sense the atmosphere shift, their chatter dying down. Richard was the first to regain some composure. He straightened his shoulders, attempting to reclaim the room, but his eyes were darting around, frantically calculating the damage. He knew what these documents meant. If the board of his manufacturing company saw that he was using corporate funds to finance his son's illegitimate child, his career would be incinerated by sunset. "You think this proves anything?" Richard asked, though his voice lacked conviction. His attempt at a scowl was weak. "You are a cold, calculating woman, Audrey. You always have been. If you try to take this to the press, if you try to leak this to our shareholders, you will be committing professional suicide. No one hires a portfolio manager who destroys their own blood for a headline." I didn't answer him immediately. I let the silence stretch, watching him sweat. He was trying to pivot to his old playbook, intimidation, manipulation, and the threat of professional ruin. It was the exact same strategy he had used when he convinced me to take out massive student loans, telling me that family support was for the weak and the unprepared. "You are going to help us," Cynthia suddenly hissed. She had regained her composure, her eyes narrowing with a familiar predatory greed. She reached out and patted Brandon's hand. Brandon is running for city council this fall. His platform is built on traditional family values. If this scandal hits the local papers, if the voters find out he is the father of Claire's baby, his career is dead before it starts. He is the golden child. He is the future of this family's name. You will deposit $250,000 into the family trust by tomorrow morning. You will replenish the funds you have exposed. You will prove your loyalty to this family, or we will make sure the entire city knows exactly how you betrayed your own flesh and blood. I could not help it. A short, dry laugh escaped my lips. I looked at my mother, then at Brandon, then at my father. They were truly delusional. They believed that because I had been their victim for 33 years, I would continue to play the role of the submissive, terrified daughter. You are asking me to pay you to fix a mess that you created, I said. You want me to fund your campaign trail so you can continue your cycle of lies? That is not a request, Richard roared, his face darkening again. It is a demand. You are a Watson. Your name is tied to ours. If we go down, you go down with us. Your career, your reputation, your precious independence, it all vanishes. You are lucky we even allow you to fix this. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply gave them a cold, lingering look that made my father shift uncomfortably. I'll think about it, I said, turning on my heel. I walked out of the estate, the heavy silence following me. Nolan held the car door open, his expression unreadable. I climbed into the passenger seat and didn't speak until we had cleared the gates. I need to go home, I said. We returned to my house in a state of intense, focused calm. I felt like a grandmaster who had just moved a rook to checkmate. My parents were so focused on their petty short-term survival that they had failed to notice I had been preparing for this day since the moment I realized they had lied to me about my tuition. Half an hour after we arrived, the doorbell rang. It wasn't my parents, and it certainly wasn't Brandon. A courier in a dark, nondescript uniform stood on my porch. He didn't say a word. He simply handed me a heavy locked briefcase and waited for my signature. I signed, took the case, and closed the door. Nolan was in the kitchen pouring me a glass of water when I set the briefcase down on the granite island. The case had a sleek, biometric fingerprint lock. I pressed my thumb against the sensor, the mechanism clicking open with a satisfying metallic snap. I lifted the lid. Inside was the rest of the puzzle. The final devastating set of documents that would not just stop them from blackmailing me, but would ensure they never spoke my name again. It was the paper trail for their entire illegal shell company scheme, including the offshore bank records that linked their corporate assets to tax fraud, money laundering, and illegal campaign donations. I hadn't just audited Brandon's baby shower fund, I had audited their entire existence. I smirked at the contents. Richard thought he could ruin my career. He hadn't realized that I had already spent the last year ensuring he had no career left to defend. The lid of the briefcase rested against the granite countertop, revealing stacks of documents, bank audits, and corporate bonds. The paper smelled of ink and victory. Nolan leaned over the kitchen island, scanning the top pages with forensic precision. He pulled a folder from the case and opened it. The embossed logo of Vanguard Holdings gleamed under the lights. Vanguard Holdings was a private shadow corporation I had legally established 3 years ago. I was the sole proprietor, the only shareholder, and the architect of its entire portfolio. For 3 long years, I had utilized Vanguard Holdings to purchase toxic corporate debt for pennies on the dollar, restructuring failing businesses and liquidating unsalvageable assets. It was a ruthless sector of the financial industry. It required a cold, calculating mindset, the mindset my family constantly criticized me for possessing. Nolan flipped through the redacted ledgers, tracing a complex web of corporate loans, deferred payments, and outstanding liabilities. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and awe. Audrey, Nolan said, his voice dropping to a hushed whisper. Tell me you did not actually do this. I stepped closer to the island, resting my hands on the cool granite. I looked down at the documents representing the culmination of my strategic planning. I nodded slowly, a predatory smile pulling at the corners of my mouth. Richard has been lying to everyone for years, I said, my voice devoid of sympathy. He boasts about the incredible growth of his manufacturing empire. He brags at the country club about his genius business acumen and expanding profit margins. It is all a fabricated illusion. His company has been hemorrhaging cash since the market shifted 4 years ago. He took out massive corporate loans to cover his operational losses. He borrowed against future inventory. He was drowning in toxic debt and secretly defaulted on his primary commercial loans 90 days ago. Nolan stared at the paperwork piecing the magnificent trap together. And the original lenders panicked, he realized, following the paper trail. They wanted to liquidate the debt immediately before his company officially declared bankruptcy. Exactly, I replied. They bundled his defaulted loans and sold them off to the highest bidder in the private sector. They sold them to Vanguard Holdings. Nolan let out a low whistle, shaking his head. You bought your own father's corporate debt. You own $15 million of his outstanding liabilities. Audrey, you are not just his daughter anymore. You are his primary creditor. You own his entire manufacturing company. The sheer irony of the situation was intoxicating. I closed my eyes, transported back to my college graduation day. I stood in the sweltering heat, proudly clutching my graduate degree in finance and economics. I worked 3 grueling jobs to pay my tuition, determined to build a career nobody could take away from me. Richard attended the ceremony in his designer suit. When I showed him my diploma, he scoffed, rolling his eyes. He told me a finance degree was a useless piece of paper for people who lacked business instincts. He said I would spend my life crunching numbers for men who built things. He mocked my education, my ambition, and my intelligence. Now that very same education was the instrument of his financial destruction. I held the strings to the empire he claimed to have built. Nolan continued to sift through the packets, his eyes darting across paragraphs of fine print and contractual jargon. He was looking for any trapdoors Richard might have installed to protect himself. Suddenly, Nolan stopped. He pushed his glasses up his nose and pulled an addendum out of the heavy stack. He read it twice, his brow furrowing in deep concentration. Audrey, he said, his voice changing tone. You need to look at this right now. I walked around the island and stood beside him, looking at the page he had isolated. It was a collateral agreement, a deeply buried clause attached to the final desperate loan Richard secured before defaulting. I read the legal text, my heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm in my chest. My father reached a point of such profound financial desperation that he bypassed his corporate assets entirely. He leveraged the house. I whispered, the reality of the document setting in. Nolan nodded, tapping the signature line. He secretly used the family estate as direct collateral to secure the final $3 million. Your mother probably has zero idea he did this. If the company defaults, the creditor assumes immediate possession of the property. I stared at the paperwork. The sprawling suburban mansion where I endured decades of emotional abuse. The immaculate estate where Cynthia hosted her high society parties. The property Richard used to intimidate everyone around him. It was all tied directly to the debt I now owned. I had the authority to seize the estate. I had the power to evict my parents, lock the gates, and make them homeless by Friday morning. The blackmail threat Richard delivered just an hour ago felt pathetic now. He thought he held the cards, but I owned the entire casino. I reached out to gather the documents, ready to formulate my strike. But before I could speak, the sudden chime of my doorbell shattered the quiet of the kitchen. I frowned, glancing at the security monitor mounted on the wall. I was not expecting any visitors today, and the gates to our driveway were locked. I tapped the screen, bringing up the video feed from the porch camera. Standing there, looking incredibly tense and exhausted, was a tall man in a dark suit. He was holding a leather briefcase of his own. It was Jamal. Sabrina's husband was standing on my porch. The corporate attorney who had discovered his wife was a felon. I looked at Nolan, an understanding passing between us. The game was escalating faster than we anticipated. I smoothed my shirt, took a deep breath, and walked to answer the door. I pulled the heavy oak door open. Jamal stood under the porch-light rain beginning to drizzle behind him. He did not look like the composed, immaculate corporate attorney who had sat at my parents' dining table just hours ago. His tie was loosened, his shoulders were slumped, and his eyes were bloodshot. In his right hand he tightly gripped a thick stack of glossy paper. I recognized the letterheads immediately. They were the physical copies of the hidden credit card statements Nolan had just unearthed. Jamal looked at me, a profound mixture of heartbreak and absolute rage etched across his face. He stepped out of the cold wind and into my foyer, handing me the stack of bills without a single word of greeting. I closed the door, the heavy click sealing us inside. He took a deep breath, looking around my home. "I am so deeply sorry," Audrey Jamal finally said. His voice was heavy with exhaustion. "I had absolutely no idea she was doing this to you. I swear to you, on my career and my life, I was completely in the dark until you threw those papers on the table today." I motioned for him to follow me into the kitchen, where Nolan was still standing by the island, the Vanguard Holdings documents safely tucked back into their briefcase. Nolan nodded at Jamal pouring a fresh cup of coffee and sliding it across the granite counter. Jamal took it, his hands shaking slightly against the warm ceramic. He took a sip and set the mug down, his expression hardening into pure, unadulterated resolve. "As an officer of the court, I cannot and will not be implicated in multiple federal felonies," Jamal stated. His tone shifted from a broken husband to a ruthless litigator. "I told Sabrina I was filing for divorce the second we got back to our house. I told her I was freezing our joint accounts and reporting her actions to the authorities to clear my own name." I watched his jaw clench tightly. Sabrina did not apologize. She did not beg for forgiveness. Instead, she completely flipped the script. She looked me dead in the eyes and threatened to ruin my entire existence. If I file for divorce and expose her financial crimes, she promised to go straight to the police and file false domestic abuse charges against me. She threatened to stage physical injuries and drag my name through the mud until I lost my law license, my reputation, and every single asset I have spent the last decade building. I stared at him in sheer disbelief, though a dark, cynical part of my brain knew exactly how Sabrina operated. She was cornered, and like our parents, her first instinct was to destroy whoever stood in her way. Jamal paced the length of my kitchen, the frustration radiating from him in waves. "For 3 years, I have smiled and nodded through their thinly veiled insults," he continued, his voice dropping to a low, furious octave. "I sat at that ridiculous Sunday brunch table, while Cynthia constantly made backhanded comments about my background. She would casually ask if my law degree was part of a diversity quota. Sabrina would laugh and tell her friends it was so trendy to have a successful black husband, treating me like a designer accessory rather than a human being. I swallowed my pride and ignored their blatant racist microaggressions because I thought I loved her. I thought I was keeping the peace. But today, seeing her leverage my race and my gender to threaten me with false abuse allegations, knowing how the legal system historically treats men who look like me, I realize she is a monster. They all are." I stepped forward and placed my hand firmly on his shoulder. "You are not fighting them alone anymore, Jamal." Nolan pulled the Vanguard Holdings briefcase back to the center of the kitchen island. I popped the biometric lock and opened the lid, turning the documents so Jamal could read the top page. I explained exactly what I had done over the past 3 years. I showed him the defaulted loans, the corporate debt, and the secret collateral clause that tied Richard's manufacturing company and the family estate directly to my shadow corporation. Jamal read the legal jargon with widening eyes, a fierce, predatory smile slowly replacing the exhaustion on his face. He looked up at me, and in that split second, a permanent, unbreakable alliance was forged. We were no longer just the marginalized in-laws and the discarded daughter. We were the executioners. "We merge our resources right now," Jamal said, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. "We do not just expose the credit card fraud. We dismantle their entire corrupt empire piece by piece. We leave them with absolutely nothing." To prove his commitment, Jamal reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out a small, highly encrypted silver USB drive and placed it directly on top of my Vanguard documents. Richard gave Sabrina access to the company's internal servers last month when he tried to set her up with a fake consulting salary to hide money from the IRS, Jamal explained. I downloaded the entire server backup before I left today. That drive contains 7 years of Richard's fraudulent corporate tax returns, illegal campaign contributions to Brandon's political fund, and offshore wire transfers. It is the final nail in their coffin. I reached out and wrapped my fingers around the cold metal of the drive, feeling the immense weight of the power it held. We had everything we needed to orchestrate their absolute destruction. But before I could plug the drive into Nolan's terminal to begin the final audit, my cell phone shattered the victorious silence in the room. The caller ID flashed brightly on the screen. It was Claire. I answered the call, and before I could even say a word, the sound of her frantic, hysterical sobbing filled the room. I dropped the first folder onto the floor, completely dismissing Sabrina and her pathetic $15,000 theft. That was merely a distraction. I took the second, much thicker folder and slammed it onto the mahogany table directly in front of my father. The heavy thud echoed through the silent dining room. I watched Richard stare at the thick stack of bank statements and internal routing numbers. The top page displayed a bold, undeniable wire transfer in the amount of $250,000. The recipient was Claire Brandon's married best friend. The memo line was blank, but the origin account belonged to the primary family trust fund. Brandon went entirely pale. The smug, entitled smirk he usually wore completely vanished from his face, replaced by sheer panic. He looked at the document, then darted his eyes toward our parents. Cynthia gasped, her hand flying to her pearl necklace. The secret they had spent months desperately trying to bury was now sitting in the open, fully exposed under the crystal chandelier. You thought you could drain $250,000 from the family trust to pay off Claire without anyone noticing, I said, keeping my voice dangerously low. I am a senior financial auditor, Richard. Did you honestly believe I would overlook a massive unauthorized withdrawal of our shared assets to cover up your golden boy's monumental mistake? Instead of expressing any remorse or attempting to apologize, my parents instantly went on the offensive. They reverted to the only strategy they truly understood. They attacked. Richard stepped forward, attempting to loom over me, his face twisting into a mask of pure, desperate rage. You are going to keep your mouth completely shut about this, Audrey, he demanded. Brandon is announcing his campaign for the local city council next month. His entire political platform is built on traditional family values and moral integrity. If the local press finds out he fathered a child with his married best friend, his political career will be destroyed before it even begins. This scandal would completely ruin him. I stared at them in utter disbelief. They had stolen from our collective trust to buy Claire's silence, yet they acted as if I were the villain for simply discovering their fraud. This family relies on optics, Cynthia chimed in, stepping to stand beside Richard. We have spent decades building an impeccable reputation in this city. You know how crucial public perception is to your father's business and your brother's future. You have to protect your brother. We need to replace those funds before the quarterly trust review next week. And here comes the punchline, I murmured, shaking my head. Richard slammed his hand onto the table, rattling the silverware. You make a ridiculous amount of money at your firm, Audrey. You will wire $250,000 into the family trust by Monday morning to replenish what we used. You will prove your loyalty to this family once and for all. If you refuse to fix this, if you dare let this secret leak and ruin your brother, I will legally disown you. I will cut you out of everything, strip your name from this family, and ensure you are dead to us. Their absolute obsession with political and social optics was sickening, though entirely predictable. Growing up in this house, my siblings and I were never viewed as actual children. We were simply public relations assets, carefully managed tools used to enhance Richard and Cynthia's social standing. I vividly remembered my high school graduation. I had just been awarded a full academic scholarship, but my mother refused to let me stand in the front of our family portrait because my dress clashed with Brandon's tie. She positioned Brandon in the center, constantly adjusting his collar, treating him like a prized show pony. When Brandon was caught cheating on his college entrance exams, Richard did not punish him. Instead, he donated a new scoreboard to the school's athletic department to ensure the incident was quietly erased from the records. They had spent my entire life covering up the flaws of their favored children to maintain a flawless facade, treating me like a disposable prop to be used only when convenient. I looked at Brandon, who was currently cowering behind our mother, too cowardly to even speak for himself. Then I looked at Richard, whose face was purple with entitled rage. He truly believed he could bully me into financing their web of lies. I did not yell. I did not argue. I simply offered them a slow, freezing smile that made Cynthia visibly shudder. "I will think about it," I said. About. Without waiting for a response, I turned on my heel and walked straight out of the dining room. I ignored Sabrina's continued sobbing and the sound of my father shouting my name. I walked out the front doors, climbed into my car, and drove away from the toxic estate. The drive back to my own house was silent and calm. I did not feel fear or anxiety about Richard's threats of disownment. In fact, his desperate attempt at blackmail only confirmed what I already knew. They were incredibly weak, terrified people clinging to an illusion of control. When I pulled into my driveway, a black delivery van was already parked near my front porch. A professional uniformed courier stood by my door holding a digital clipboard. I approached him, verifying my identity and signing the encrypted digital receipt. Without a single word, the courier handed me a heavy locked steel briefcase and returned to his vehicle. I carried the heavy case inside and set it securely on my kitchen island. I entered the complex alphanumeric code into the biometric lock. The latches clicked open with a satisfying heavy snap. I lifted the lid, revealing stacks of legally binding documents, corporate transfer deeds, and comprehensive financial audits. I smiled, looking down at the paperwork. My secret weapon had finally arrived. The sobbing echoing from my phone speaker was a masterpiece of desperation. I pressed the device to my ear, listening to the jagged intakes of breath that Claire had perfected over a lifetime of manipulation. Jamal stood still in my kitchen, his jaw clenched, while Nolan paused with his hand hovering over the drive. I put the call on speakerphone and placed it on the granite island so they could hear every word. "Audrey, please!" Claire wailed, her voice cracking with manufactured panic. "You are the only person I can call. I am so scared." I kept my expression perfectly neutral, motioning for Jamal to remain silent. "What is wrong, Claire?" I asked, infusing my tone with false concern. "Where are you?" "He found out," Claire cried. "My husband found out about the baby. He found out about Brandon. He went crazy, Audrey. He hit me. He struck me and threw me out with only the clothes on my back. I am sitting in my car in a parking lot and I do not have a dime. He froze our joint accounts. You have to help me." I looked at Nolan, who raised a skeptical eyebrow. I remembered this from high school. Claire always utilized tears as a weapon. When we were 16, she convinced me to take her mother's car for a joyride. When we dented the bumper, Claire dissolved into hysterical tears in front of our parents. She was attempting the same strategy now, banking on my habit of absorbing her collateral damage. "I am so incredibly sorry, Claire," I murmured, keeping my voice validating. "That sounds terrifying. What do you need me to do?" "I need to get out of the state," she whimpered. "I need to hire an attorney to protect myself. I just need an emergency loan, Audrey, just $50,000 to secure an apartment and retainer fees. I swear I will pay you back. You are my best friend." The audacity was staggering. She was carrying my brother's child, receiving money from my parents, and yet had the nerve to demand $50,000 from me. She viewed me as a disposable bank vault. "Of course, Claire," I said. "You know I will always support you. I will authorize the wire transfer with my bank by the end of the week. Just lay low until the funds clear." "Oh my God, thank you, Audrey," she breathed. "You are saving my life." I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the counter. The silence lasted for 3 seconds before Nolan let out a laugh. He turned back to his terminal, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "Do not transfer money to that woman," Jamal said, his hands gripping the edge of the island. "She is lying. I can guarantee her husband did not lay a finger on her. This is what Sabrina threatened to do to me." "I have zero intention of funding her fake escape," I replied smoothly, "but I needed her to lower her guard." Nolan tapped the enter key. I gave Claire a baby monitor for her shower last month. He said, his eyes fixed on the monitors. I told her I configured the security settings myself to ensure it was unhackable. Nolan grinned. I lied. He executed a command, and the right monitor flickered to life. A clear video feed appeared on the screen, broadcasting from Claire's living room. The visual evidence was absolute. Claire was not sitting in her car in a parking lot. She was lounging on her suede sofa. She held a wine glass, unconcerned about the child she carried. Her face was pristine. She looked radiant, relaxed, and smug. And she was not alone. Brandon sat next to her on the couch. He had his arm draped over the back of the cushions, laughing as Claire tossed her phone onto the coffee table. The audio feed kicked in, picking up their conversation. I cannot believe she actually bought that. Brandon chuckled. You barely even had to try. Audrey has always been pathetic, Claire replied, taking a sip of wine. She is so desperate for connection that she will pay up just to keep us around. It is sad how easy it is to manipulate her. Brandon leaned back, looking satisfied. Well, that 50 grand is going to cover our European baby moon. Cynthia and Richard can keep paying for the house and the medical bills, but I am not spending my summer hiding in the suburbs. We are going to the Amalfi Coast. I stood in my kitchen listening to my brother and my best friend mock my loyalty. They were plotting a vacation funded by my money. The rage I felt did not manifest as an explosion. It solidified into calculating ice. They were treating me like a disposable bank account. They assumed my wealth was theirs to harvest. Jamal stared at the screen, his jaw set in a rigid line of disgust. They feed on your success because they are incapable of building their own. I did not reply. I watched the feed of Brandon and Claire celebrating their victory. I held the keys to their destruction. I had the tax returns on the USB drive. I had the Vanguard Holdings debt structures that could seize the family estate. Now I had the video evidence of their extortion attempt. The trap was armed and ready to snap shut. Before we could strategize our next move, the sound of the mail slot snapping shut echoed through the hallway. I left the kitchen and walked to the entryway, picking up the heavy envelope resting on the floor. It was addressed to me in calligraphy. I flipped it over, breaking the wax seal, and pulled out a gold-embossed card. I read the text, a smile spreading across my face, as the perfect stage for their demise presented itself. It was an invitation for my parents' 40th anniversary gala, hosted at the Platinum Country Club next weekend. The gold-embossed lettering on the heavy cardstock practically vibrated with my parents' signature brand of arrogant excess. I ran my fingers over the textured surface of the invitation to their 40th anniversary gala at the elite Platinum Country Club. But it was the smaller, pristine white insert tucked behind the main card that caught my undivided attention. The text was printed in a sharp, elegant script detailing the evening's itinerary. At the bottom, a special announcement was highlighted. Richard and Cynthia proudly invited their guests to witness the official appointment of Brandon as the sole heir and chief executive officer of the family empire. Furthermore, they planned to publicly gift the historic family estate to Brandon and Claire, framing it as a grand gesture to welcome their new grandchild into the world. I stared at the insert, a cold laugh escaping my lips. The absolute delusion was staggering. Richard was preparing to stand in front of the city's most influential politicians, business leaders, and socialites to pass down an empire that was essentially entirely hollow. He was giving away a multi-million-dollar estate that was completely encumbered by Vanguard Holdings. He was gifting property he no longer legally possessed. The sheer arrogance of their plan was the exact catalyst I needed to orchestrate a public execution of their social standing. The following morning, I met Jamal in the private conference room of my downtown office. The sleek glass walls provided a panoramic view of the city, matching the cold, clear focus we both shared. Jamal spread his legal folders across the polished conference table, his eyes sharp and completely devoid of the exhaustion that had plagued him days ago. We spent the next 4 hours meticulously synchronizing our timelines. Jamal confirmed he had officially filed his divorce papers under a strict judicial seal. Sabrina remained completely oblivious, busy planning her luxury outfits for the upcoming gala, while her marriage and financial security were legally dismantled behind her back. Meanwhile, I finalized the towering stack of Vanguard Holdings documentation. I authorized the immediate foreclosure notices on the family estate and prepared the involuntary bankruptcy filings for Richard's manufacturing company. The paperwork was absolutely bulletproof, layered with ironclad clauses that completely trapped them in their own fraudulent debt structures. We synchronized our strikes perfectly, ensuring that when the hammer fell, my family would have absolutely no legal or financial avenues for escape. With the legal trap securely set, I left the office and drove to an exclusive high-end tailor in the city's fashion district. For 30 years, I had allowed my mother to dictate my appearance. As I walked past the racks of imported silk and velvet, a vivid memory flashed through my mind. I was 18, preparing for my senior prom. Cynthia had forcefully steered me away from a vibrant crimson dress, insisting I purchase a drab, washed-out beige gown instead. She had pinched my waist, critically examining my posture in the mirror, and told me I simply lacked the bone structure for bold fashion. She claimed the beige suited my quiet personality, ensuring I faded into the background while Claire and Sabrina dominated the spotlight in custom sequins. My entire life I had been styled to be the mousy, invisible scapegoat. That ended today. I selected a stunning floor-length gown in a deep predatory shade of emerald green. The cut was aggressive and sharp, featuring a plunging neckline and a dramatic slit that commanded absolute attention. When I stepped out of the dressing room and looked at my reflection in the three-way mirror, the transformation was undeniable. I did not look like the discarded middle child. I looked like a woman who owned the room. The tailor pinned the waist, perfectly accentuating my figure. I paid in cash, instructing them to have the alterations finished by the end of the week. I was going to walk into that country club and completely shatter their carefully constructed illusion. The morning of the highly anticipated gala finally arrived with crisp, perfectly clear blue skies. I sat quietly at my home office terminal, a fresh cup of dark roast coffee resting beside my glowing keyboard. Nolan was logged into the secure network, remotely carefully monitoring the live digital traffic as I prepared my final devastating financial maneuver. Because my hidden shadow corporation held the absolute primary liens on Richard's vulnerable business assets, and the family trust, I possessed the unilateral authority to trigger an immediate default protocol. I smoothly accessed the master banking portal, skillfully navigating through the incredibly complex, tangled network of my family's private financial accounts. I saw the various joint credit cards, the exorbitant corporate expense accounts, and Brandon's platinum lines of credit. They were all inextricably linked to the very collateral I now legally controlled. With slow, deliberate keystrokes, I initiated a total, irrevocable hard freeze on every single credit line attached to the Wilson family name. I did not execute the command immediately. Instead, I accessed the timing protocols, my eyes fixed on the digital clock on my screen. The gala was scheduled to begin at 6 precisely, with Richard's grand announcement slated for the middle of the luxurious dinner service. I set the execution timer for exactly 8 in the evening. It was the exact moment the country club management would automatically run my father's primary platinum card to cover the exorbitant catering and venue costs for the 500 guests. I locked the secure system and stepped away from the polished desk, a profound sense of ultimate satisfaction washing over my entire body. The timer was ticking down. The brutal divorce papers were sealed. The devastating foreclosure documents were printed. Tonight, my proud father would excitedly stand at a decorated podium and try to hand Brandon a golden kingdom that did not exist. Tonight, the wealthy elites of our city would watch the mighty Wilson family burn to the ground. Tonight, they would all truly finally pay for their sins. The Platinum Country Club was a fortress of old money and manufactured prestige. Valets in crisp white jackets rushed to open luxury vehicles as Nolan and I pulled up. I stepped out the cool evening air, catching the heavy silk of my emerald gown. The aggressive cut and plunging neckline felt like a suit of armor. I had spent my entire life shrinking into the background, wearing muted colors to avoid my mother's harsh critiques. Tonight, I was impossible to ignore. Nolan stood beside me in a tailored charcoal tuxedo, offering his arm with a knowing smile. We walked up the marble steps and passed through the oak doors, stepping into a world built entirely on predatory social maneuvering. The grand ballroom was a spectacle of excessive wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the attendees. The room was packed with the city's most influential figures. I spotted local politicians sipping champagne, prominent real estate investors, exchanging business cards, and socialites draped in diamonds they could barely afford. The air hummed with the sound of string instruments and calculated networking. My parents had spared no expense to orchestrate the perfect backdrop for their grand illusion. As we navigated the crowded foyer, the sea of tailored suits and evening gowns parted. People turned to stare. A few whispered behind their crystal flutes, their eyes tracking the emerald silk that trailed behind me. I kept my posture straight, ignoring the stares and focusing on the layout of the room. Right in the center of the ballroom, elevated on a raised platform, sat the VIP table. It was draped in white silk and adorned with massive arrangements of white orchids. Brandon sat at the center looking smug in a velvet dinner jacket. Claire sat directly to his right wearing a maternity gown that clung to her figure, clutching a flute of sparkling cider. Sabrina was positioned on his left, her posture rigid, her smile plastered in place as she nodded at passing guests. They looked like the perfect picture of aristocratic succession. My quiet observation was abruptly interrupted by a sharp tap on my arm. I turned to find Cynthia standing there, her face pinched into a tight, disapproving sneer. She wore a heavy silver gown that looked more like armor than fabric, her neck weighed down by the family pearls. She looked me up and down, her eyes narrowing as she took in the expensive cut of my dress and the unmistakable confidence in my posture. "I see you decided to make a spectacle of yourself," Cynthia murmured, her voice dripping with venom. "We are trying to project elegance tonight, Audrey, not desperation." Before I could respond, she leaned in close, her manicured fingers digging sharply into my forearm. The heavy scent of her floral perfume was suffocating. She lowered her voice to a harsh, demanding whisper. "I hope you brought the $50,000 for Claire. Do not ruin our night by being poor, Audrey. Brandon needs this transition to be absolutely flawless." I looked down at her hand, then met her eyes with a perfectly neutral expression. "Oh, I brought exactly what this family deserves," I replied smoothly, pulling my arm away from her grasp. Cynthia glared at me clearly, unsettled by my complete lack of intimidation. She signaled to a passing hostess with a sharp snap of her fingers. "Show them to their assigned seats," she ordered the young woman. "We have important guests to entertain." Nolan and I followed the hostess away from the glamorous center of the room. We walked past the politicians, past the investors, and past the wealthy socialites. We kept walking until the tables grew smaller, the floral centerpieces shrank, and the lighting became noticeably dimmer. We were led to the very back of the massive ballroom, far away from the stage and the cameras. The hostess stopped at table 30. It was shoved into a dark corner positioned directly next to the heavy swinging metal doors of the catering kitchen. Every time a waiter rushed out with a tray of appetizers, the loud crash of the doors echoed over the table. I looked at our dinner companions. We were seated alongside 3 off-duty venue coordinators and 2 distant estranged cousins who had not been invited to a family function in over a decade. It was the ultimate social insult. My parents had intentionally placed me in the culinary crossfire to remind me of my absolute insignificance. Nolan pulled out my chair, his jaw clenched, as a waiter nearly clipped his shoulder with a tray of champagne flutes. "They really do not pull their punches, do they?" he noted, taking his seat beside me. I smoothed the emerald silk over my lap and checked the platinum watch on my wrist. It was exactly 7:30. I smiled, feeling the cold, calculating anticipation running through my veins. "Let them have their petty seating chart," I said softly. "They are completely oblivious to the fact that they are standing on a financial landmine." The minutes ticked by, each one bringing us closer to 8 o'clock. I watched the room from my dark corner, taking in the sheer magnitude of the fraud playing out before my eyes. Richard was circling the room, shaking hands with city council members and laughing with corporate donors. He was projecting the image of a titan, a patriarch preparing to pass down a thriving empire to his golden son. He had no idea that his entire reality was about to detonate. At 7:55, the low hum of the string quartet faded away. The bright ambient lights in the ballroom began to slowly dim, casting dramatic shadows across the walls. A single brilliant spotlight pierced the darkness, illuminating the center stage. The room fell into an expectant, heavy silence. The clinking of glasses ceased as all 500 guests turned their attention toward the podium. Richard stepped into the bright circle of light, adjusting his silk tie and tapping the microphone. Microphone feedback sliced through the ballroom, bringing the low hum of conversations to an abrupt halt. The spotlight glared down on Richard, illuminating his tailored velvet tuxedo. He stood at the podium addressing his subjects. Cynthia sat gazing up from the VIP table in a highly rehearsed display of adoring devotion. Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate 40 years of building a legacy that will echo through this city for generations. Richard began, his baritone voice, expertly modulated to sound both humble and commanding. Appreciative laughter rippled through the audience. I watched from the shadows of Table 30, observing local politicians, investors, and socialites nodding along like synchronized puppets. They were mesmerized. We built the Wilson Empire from the ground up, Richard continued. It was forged on traditional family values, integrity, and absolute loyalty. We have always believed that a strong family is the foundation of a strong community. Tonight, we look not just to our past, but to our bright, expansive future. The irony was suffocating. He was preaching about moral integrity while secretly bleeding his company dry and paying off his son's mistress with stolen trust funds. It is time to pass the torch to the next generation, Richard announced. I would like my son Brandon to join me up here. The ballroom erupted into deafening applause. Brandon stood up, buttoning his dinner jacket with a smug grin, and strode up the stairs to stand beside our father. Richard threw a heavy arm around Brandon's shoulders, pulling him into a proud, highly publicized embrace. Brandon has been the driving force behind our corporate expansion, Richard declared. He is a visionary leader. It is my absolute honor to officially name him the sole heir and the new chief executive officer of Wilson Holdings. The sycophants in the audience cheered louder, raising champagne flutes in the air. I watched Brandon soak in the adoration, fully aware that the company he had just been handed was currently suffocating under massive defaulted loans. He was being crowned the king of a graveyard. But a man cannot build an empire alone. Richard continued, raising a hand to quiet the cheering crowd. He needs a strong foundation. He needs a family. And tonight, I am thrilled to announce that the Wilson family is growing. Richard gestured grandly toward the VIP table. Claire stood up, smoothing the fabric of her maternity gown over her slightly swelling stomach. She looked coy, playing the role of the bashful, radiant mother-to-be with sickening perfection. Claire, please come join us, Richard coaxed warmly. She glided up to the stage, taking Brandon's outstretched hand. Richard beamed at the two of them, completely ignoring the reality of the situation. He did not care that Claire was still legally married to a man who had trusted Brandon like a brother. He did not care about the deception. Sometimes destiny requires us to make difficult choices, Richard said, his tone shifting to sound profound and philosophical. Sometimes it takes a true, capable leader to step up and provide where lesser, weaker men have completely failed. Brandon recognized what was truly important. He recognized that family is paramount. We are welcoming Claire into our fold, and we are celebrating the impending arrival of my very first grandson. A collective gasp of delight swept through the ballroom, followed by another round of thunderous applause. The sheer audacity of it made my pulse race. Richard was openly celebrating an affair. He was publicly humiliating Claire's absent, discarded husband, framing Brandon's betrayal as an act of noble salvation. To ensure this new branch of our family has the perfect start, Cynthia and I are officially transferring the deed of the historic Wilson family estate to Brandon and Claire, Richard announced proudly. A home for the next generation of our legacy. Claire covered her mouth, producing a flawless display of manufactured tears as Brandon pulled her into a kiss. The crowd swooned. The echo chamber functioned flawlessly. These wealthy enablers did not care about the truth. They only cared about proximity to power. They applauded the theft, the cheating, and the arrogance because the Wilsons threw the best parties and signed the biggest checks. Then the warmth vanished from Richard's face. His expression hardened into a severe, judgmental mask. His eyes scanned the room, cutting through the darkness, until they landed directly on table 30, pinning me to my seat next to the swinging kitchen doors. "We believe in loyalty above all else," Richard intoned, his voice dropping to a cold, resonant octave that echoed through the silent room. "We believe that family protects family. And to those in our family who have chosen selfishness over loyalty, we pray you eventually find your way back to grace." The ballroom fell into a heavy, uncomfortable hush. 500 heads turned simultaneously, following Richard's condemning glare toward the back of the room. The guests stared at me, their faces painted with judgment and aristocratic pity. I was the disgraced daughter. I was the selfish outcast who had ruined the family portrait. My father had just publicly shamed me in front of the entire city, expecting me to wither under the heat of his disapproval and beg for his forgiveness. I sat perfectly still for 3 seconds. I felt Nolan shift beside me, eyes locked on my face. I placed my linen napkin on the table. I stood up. The emerald silk of my gown caught the dim light, shimmering like a blade in the darkness. The remaining scattered applause died instantly. The room fell completely, totally dead silent. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Even Richard paused, his smug expression faltering as he realized I was not shrinking away. I stepped out from behind table 30. I kept my chin leveled, my shoulders back, and my eyes locked dead on my father. I slowly began to walk toward the brightly lit stage, the sharp, rhythmic clicking of my heels echoing like gunshots across the polished marble floor. The rhythmic clicking of my heels echoed like a metronome counting down to their destruction. 500 pairs of eyes tracked my movement as I crossed the Platinum Country Club ballroom. The heavy emerald silk of my gown billowed behind me. Whispers erupted from the VIP tables, a frantic buzzing of confused socialites, but I tuned them all out. My focus remained entirely locked on the raised platform ahead. Richard stood frozen at the podium. His hand hovered in midair, his mouth slightly parted in utter disbelief. He had expected me to cower in the shadows by the kitchen doors, weeping into my napkin. Instead, I was marching directly into his spotlight. Cynthia rose from her seat, her face draining of color as she reached out to grab Brandon's arm. Brandon just stared at me, his smug, velvet-clad shoulders suddenly rigid. I reached the base of the stairs leading up to the stage. I did not hesitate. I climbed them with a slow, deliberate grace, my eyes never leaving my father. When I stepped into the blinding spotlight, the heat felt empowering rather than intimidating. Richard stepped back instinctively, his polished facade cracking to reveal the panicked old man underneath. "What do you think you are doing?" Richard hissed, his voice dropping to a harsh, desperate whisper, meant only for me. "Get off this stage immediately before you embarrass yourself further." I did not answer him. I simply reached out and took the microphone directly from his trembling hand. He was too stunned by my sheer audacity to pull it away. I turned to face the vast sea of faces in the ballroom. I smiled brightly, projecting an aura of absolute, unshakable confidence. As I looked out over the crowd, a distinct memory surfaced. I was 22, standing in my father's corporate boardroom presenting a strategy I had spent 3 weeks developing. Richard had cut me off 2 slides in, laughing dismissively in front of his entire board. He told me to sit down and take notes. He said I lacked the spine for public speaking, that I did not possess the edge required to command a room. He claimed I was born to be a supporting character in Brandon's inevitable rise to glory. He was wrong. Standing here now, feeling the absolute silence of 500 captive listeners, I realized I possessed more spine than my father. I was not shrinking. I was expanding, filling the massive room with a presence that demanded total obedience. "Thank you, Richard, for that introduction," I said, my voice projecting crisp and clear through the state-of-the-art sound system. A collective gasp rippled through the front rows. My father flinched as I used his first name, dropping the familial title to sever the connection between us publicly. "Dad is right about loyalty." I continued, pacing slowly across the stage, owning every inch of the platform. Loyalty is the cornerstone of any successful enterprise. It is the glue that holds a family together, and no one understands the profound, intimate nature of loyalty, quite like my brother and his lovely new partner. I gestured gracefully toward the VIP table. Brandon's face had flushed a deep, ugly crimson. Claire shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her hands dropping protectively over her maternity gown. She darted a panicked glance at Brandon, clearly sensing the dangerous shift in the atmosphere. In fact, I said, leaning slightly into the microphone, letting my words echo off the vaulted ceilings. Brandon and Claire are so incredibly loyal to each other. They share absolutely everything. They share their time, they share their future, and most importantly, they share secrets. The silence in the ballroom shifted from expectant to electric. The politicians and investors exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that the script had been violently derailed. Cynthia tried to stand her mouth opening to object, but a sharp, unified murmur from the crowd forced her back down into her chair. They wanted to see the spectacle play out. While I held the room captivated, a shadow moved seamlessly at the back of the ballroom. Nolan had abandoned his seat at table 30 and slipped unnoticed into the elevated audio-visual control booth overlooking the entire venue. Through the glass window, I saw the faint blue glow of his laptop screen, illuminating his focused expression. The venue technicians, likely bribed or simply intimidated by his authoritative demeanor, stood aside as he rapidly plugged his custom interface directly into the country club's master system. I gave a subtle nod toward the back of the room. Nolan hit the execution command. Behind me, the massive 30-foot projector screen that had previously displayed a stagnant, elegant monogram of the Wilson family crest abruptly flickered to life. The sudden burst of harsh white light illuminated the stage, casting giant, imposing shadows across the ballroom walls. The sudden visual shift caused several guests in the front row to jump in their seats. Richard finally lunged forward, his hands grasping frantically for the microphone. "Turn that off," he commanded, his voice cracking with genuine terror. "Security, remove her from the stage immediately." I effortlessly sidestepped his clumsy grab, keeping the microphone secured in my grip. Two security guards stepped forward from the wings, but I raised my hand in a sharp, halting gesture. They froze, unsure of whether to obey the patriarch or the woman who was currently commanding the room with absolute authority. The fear in his eyes was exactly what I had always wanted to see, a total submission to the daughter he had discarded and underestimated. This was my empire now. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small remote. I looked at Claire. I looked at Brandon. I looked at Richard. And then, maintaining absolute chilling eye contact with the very monsters who had ruined me, I finally smiled. I pressed a single tiny solid red button. The audio recording from Claire's living room blasts through the surround sound speakers. The sharp click of the small red button was entirely masked by the sudden overwhelming blast of audio that instantly flooded the Platinum Country Club ballroom. Nolan had perfectly bypassed the venue limiters, routing the crystal-clear audio file through every single surround sound speaker simultaneously. There was no static, no distortion, and absolutely no room for misinterpretation. The volume was dialed to maximum. "Your parents are so stupid, Brandon." Claire's unmistakable syrupy voice echoed off the vaulted ceilings, bouncing between the crystal chandeliers. "They actually think this baby is yours. Once we get Audrey's 50,000, I'm booking the flights to Paris." A collective gasp was violently sucked out of 500 pairs of lungs. The sound was a physical force, a tidal wave of shock that swept across the sea of elite politicians, wealthy investors, and diamond-draped socialites. I stood motionless on the stage, the microphone resting passively at my side, watching the absolute destruction of my family's carefully curated, decades-long aristocratic illusion. "Who cares whose kid it is?" Brandon's arrogant, chuckling voice fired back through the speakers, answering Claire with bone-chilling clarity. "As long as the old man signs over the house, the personal trainer can have visiting rights." The ensuing pandemonium was instantaneous and completely catastrophic. The immaculate silence of the ballroom shattered into 1,000 pieces. Brandon stood paralyzed on the raised platform beside me. His smug, victorious smile melted away, replaced by an expression of raw, unadulterated horror. His hand went entirely limp. The delicate crystal champagne flute slipped from his fingers, plummeting to the floor and shattering violently against the polished marble. The sharp sound of breaking glass acted like a starting pistol for the chaos. At the VIP table below, Claire let out a piercing, hysterical shriek. She scrambled backward, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. Panic entirely overtook her features as the judgmental eyes of the city's most powerful elites pinned her down. She lunged away from the table, desperate to escape the blinding spotlight and the whispering crowd, but her frantic movements betrayed her. The hem of her expensive, trailing maternity gown tangled violently around her stilettos. She pitched forward, tripping over the heavy fabric, and collapsed onto the carpet in a pathetic, undignified heap. Cynthia did not even reach out to help her pregnant daughter-in-law. My mother sat entirely frozen, her manicured hands clutching her pearl necklace so tightly her knuckles turned a stark, bruised white. The pristine, aristocratic facade she had spent 40 grueling years constructing evaporated into thin air in less than 20 seconds. The perfect family she had continuously flaunted to mask her own insecurities, utilizing Brandon's hollow accomplishments as her primary shield against societal judgment, was now completely exposed as a nest of parasitic frauds. The real-time fallout among the guests was swift and merciless. These were people who survived entirely on reputation, proximity to power, and the illusion of moral superiority. I watched as the local politicians, the very men and women who had just been clapping their hands raw for Brandon, physically recoiled. They actively turned their backs on the VIP table, creating a visible, widening circle of isolation around my family. The state senator who had shaken Brandon's hand just 10 minutes earlier signaled immediately to his security detail, discreetly moving toward the heavy oak exit doors to avoid being photographed near the scandal. The corporate investors leaned into their aides furiously, whispering instructions to distance their portfolios from Wilson Holdings. The echo chamber of enablers had instantly transformed into a firing squad of social executioners. They were abandoning the sinking ship without a singular shred of hesitation, whispering harshly about the profound humiliation. Sabrina sat frozen at the end of the VIP table, her face draining of all color. She realized in real time that her own husband's secrets might be the next thing broadcast across the massive projector screen. The absolute terror in her eyes confirmed Jamal's warning. On the stage, Richard was undergoing a terrifying physical transformation. The authoritative patriarch who had just arrogantly condemned me to the entire room was completely gone. His face transitioned from a pale shock to a dangerous mottled shade of deep purple. He stumbled backward, his hand flying up to clutch his chest as his breathing became ragged and shallow. He looked like a man drowning in dry air. For a fleeting second, I wondered if his heart would simply give out under the immense crushing weight of his ultimate public humiliation. But his venomous rage quickly overpowered his physical weakness. He realized that his grand coronation, his masterpiece of social engineering, had been hijacked and weaponized against him. He spun toward the back of the ballroom, his eyes wildly searching the upper balcony for the audio-visual booth. He spotted Nolan standing behind the glass, his hands still resting casually on the control board. "Cut the sound!" Richard screamed, his voice stripping away his polished baritone, cracking into a feral shriek. "Turn that off right now, security! Get up there and cut the sound!" But Nolan had already locked the system interface. The recording looped, playing Claire and Brandon's damning confession a second time, drilling the humiliation deeper into the minds of every single guest in attendance. The speakers projected their treachery with a brutal, unrelenting force. Richard realized he could not stop the audio. He whipped his head around, his manic gaze locking onto me. The veins in his neck and forehead bulged against his skin, throbbing visibly under the bright stage lights. He closed the distance between us in 3 long, aggressive strides, entirely abandoning any remaining pretense of civility. He pointed a trembling, rage-filled finger directly at my face, his chest heaving with exertion. "I will sue you for absolutely everything you have!" Richard violently screamed, spittle flying from his lips as the microphone picked up his raw, unfiltered fury. "I will use every single cent of my company to crush you." I listened to the echoing threat bounce off the crystal chandeliers. Richard stood there, his chest heaving, his face a violent shade of purple, promising to use his vast corporate wealth to crush me into the dirt. A sound bubbled up from deep within my chest. It started as a low, amused breath and quickly evolved into a sharp, echoing laugh. It was a cold, genuine sound that cut right through the heavy tension gripping the Platinum Country Club ballroom. The sheer absurdity of his threat was the perfect punchline to a 40-year joke. "With what money, Richard?" I asked, my voice slicing through the silence of the massive ballroom like a newly sharpened surgical scalpel. He blinked rapidly, the furious momentum of his rage faltering for a mere fraction of a second. The elite wealth-obsessed audience leaned in collectively, completely captivated. They were predators drawn to the scent of blood, and they could sense a massive shift in the power dynamic. I did not wait for his slow, panicking brain to process the question. I raised my hand and snapped my fingers. Up in the audio-visual booth, Nolan did not miss a beat. He executed the next command sequence. The massive projector screen behind Richard and Brandon flickered, dropping the damning audio transcript and replacing it with a series of highly classified, meticulously detailed corporate financial records. The Vanguard Holdings logo materialized in stark, undeniable high definition, hovering like a bird of prey over my father's head. Beside the logo, a cascade of heavily redacted banking statements, defaulted loan notifications, and asset seizure warnings scrolled downward. Murmurs erupted across the VIP tables. The wealthy investors in the room instantly recognized the Vanguard crest. It was the shadowy, aggressive private equity firm that had been quietly and ruthlessly buying up distressed industrial assets across the eastern seaboard for the past 5 years. They knew the name. They feared the firm, they just had no idea who was pulling the strings. I stepped closer to the edge of the stage, looking down at the very people who had spent my entire life ignoring my existence. Allow me to properly introduce myself to those of you who only know me as the quiet, disappointing middle child of the Wilson family. I announced, my voice steady and commanding. I am Audrey Wilson. I am the sole founder, primary shareholder, and chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings. A collective gasp swept through the room. A prominent real estate developer in the second row actually dropped his program. Cynthia slumped back in her chair, her hands flying to her mouth. Brandon looked back at the massive screen, his eyes darting frantically over the complex financial data he lacked the basic education to understand. And as the CEO of Vanguard Holdings, I continued pacing the length of the stage to ensure every single guest heard my next words. I have a legal obligation to inform the investors, politicians, and socialites in this room that Wilson Manufacturing is not a thriving empire. It is a rotting corpse. Richard's company has been functionally bankrupt for 8 months. Richard staggered back, gripping the wooden podium to keep his balance. "You are lying," he sputtered, though the utter terror in his eyes confirmed the absolute truth. "This is a fabrication. Our quarterly projections are rock solid." "Your quarterly projections are a work of creative fiction, Richard," I countered smoothly. "Let us talk about your visionary leadership. 5 years ago, when the manufacturing sector shifted toward automated logistics, you refused to adapt. You called the new technology a passing fad. Instead of investing in your infrastructure, you siphoned corporate funds to maintain this pathetic illusion of extreme wealth." I pointed to the scrolling documents on the screen behind him. "When the revenue streams dried up, you panicked. You took out massive high-interest mezzanine loans from predatory lenders just to cover your exorbitant personal expenses. Cynthia's endless country club dues, Brandon's luxury vehicles, and Claire's extravagant lifestyle. You leveraged the company pension fund. You leveraged the supply chain assets. You bled your own company dry to fund your fragile ego." The investors in the room were already pulling out their phones, frantically texting their brokers. The state senator who had championed Richard's business practices earlier that evening looked physically ill. They realized their associations with him were now toxic. "What you did not know," I said, leaning into the microphone, "is that Vanguard Holdings bought every single one of those toxic notes. I own your corporate debt, Richard. I own the supply chain contracts. I own the outstanding payroll liabilities. You thought I was a mousy scapegoat working a dead-end corporate job. In reality, I was sitting in a boardroom across the city, meticulously acquiring the literal deed to your entire life. Brandon finally seemed to grasp the magnitude of the situation. He looked down at Claire, who was still weeping on the floor in a tangled heap of silk, and then looked at his father. The golden kingdom he had been promised was nothing but a mountain of toxic debt. "You cannot do this," Brandon stammered, his voice cracking like a frightened child. "Dad, tell her she cannot do this. I hold the primary liens on everything." I stated, my tone devoid of any sympathy. "Your luxury cars, your expense accounts, the credit cards you use to buy designer clothes, they all belong to Vanguard." I reached into the hidden pocket of my emerald gown and withdrew a thick folded legal document. It was bound with a thick gold ribbon and stamped with a heavy, undeniable red wax seal. The physical weight of the paper matched the gravity of the moment. I proudly held the heavy document up high, letting the harsh stage lights perfectly catch the glowing crimson seal. "And about that beautiful historic family estate you just so generously gifted to Brandon and his miserable mistress," I said, my voice echoing with devastating finality. I held the heavy document up high, letting the harsh stage lights perfectly catch the glowing crimson seal. I unfolded the thick parchment with agonizing slowness, making sure the microphone caught the sharp crinkle of the heavy paper. I did not look at Brandon or Claire. I looked directly at Cynthia. "This is not a deed of gift," I announced, my voice ringing with absolute clarity. "This is a primary collateral agreement. 6 months ago, when Richard needed a sudden infusion of capital to keep his vital supply chain from collapsing entirely, he put up the Wilson family estate as collateral. He signed the historic mansion, the grounds, the stables, and every piece of antique furniture inside it over to Vanguard Holdings." I snapped my free hand. Nolan did not miss a beat. The projector screen behind me shifted, instantly displaying the final page of the contract. There, blown up to 10 feet tall, was Richard's unmistakable, sprawling signature, placed right next to the undeniable Vanguard corporate seal. "You do not own that house, Richard," I said, dropping my arm. "You do not have the legal authority to gift it to Brandon or Claire or their unborn child. You are a tenant in my property." The ballroom remained trapped in a suffocating, breathless silence. Nobody dared to cough. Nobody dared to reach for their champagne. They were watching the absolute brutal dismantling of a dynasty. "And as your landlord," I continued, pacing slowly back toward the center of the stage, "I have been reviewing your account. You have missed 3 consecutive mortgage payments. You have ignored 7 formal notices of default sent via certified mail to your corporate office. Therefore, I am officially executing my right to reclaim the entire asset." I turned to face Cynthia, who was gripping the edge of her table so hard the veins in her hands looked ready to burst. "Vanguard Holdings is foreclosing on the Wilson family estate," I declared, letting the words strike her like physical blows. "Effective tonight at exactly midnight, the property officially changes hands. My private security team is currently waiting at the front gates. If you or any of your guests attempt to enter the premises after midnight, you will be arrested for criminal trespassing." Cynthia let out a visceral, high-pitched shriek that tore through the elegant room. It was not the measured theatrical gasp of a socialite. It was the raw, primal scream of a woman watching her entire identity evaporate into nothingness. The poised, untouchable matriarch completely vanished. She scrambled out of her chair, her knees buckling as she reached the bottom of the stage stairs. She actually dropped to her knees on the marble floor, her expensive diamond earrings swinging wildly as she looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Audrey, please," Cynthia begged, her voice cracking, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face, completely ruining her makeup. "You cannot do this. We have nowhere to go. All of my things are in that house. My clothes, my jewelry, my entire life is in that house. Please, I am your mother. You cannot put us on the street." I looked down at the woman who had spent 35 years making me feel completely invisible. I felt no pity. I felt absolutely nothing but the cold, hard satisfaction of a closed ledger. I stepped to the very edge of the stage, looking directly down into her pleading, desperate eyes. "Try Uber," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. I hear they are great for quick moves. Before Cynthia could unleash another hysterical sob, a new figure marched aggressively through the parting crowd of stunned guests. It was Monsieur Laurent, the Platinum Country Club's notoriously strict general manager. His face was flushed red, and he clutched a leather-bound folio so tightly his knuckles were white. He did not care about the familial drama unfolding on stage. He cared about his own bottom line. He stormed directly up the stairs, bypassing the weeping Cynthia and the paralyzed Richard. "Mr. Wilson," Laurent barked, his thick French accent completely stripped of its usual hospitality. "I demand an immediate explanation." Richard blinked, completely disoriented by the sudden interruption. "Laurent, not now. We are dealing with a family matter." "This is a business matter," Laurent countered sharply, slapping the leather-bound folio against the wooden podium. "You presented your corporate black card to cover the $100,000 catering and venue fee for tonight's gala. My accounting department just attempted to process the final authorization." Laurent turned to address the entire room, his voice booming. "The card has been declined. In fact, all 5 of the backup credit cards you put on file have been completely frozen." I smiled quietly to myself. At exactly 8 o'clock, right when the appetizers were being served, I had instructed Vanguard's legal department to execute the total freeze on all of Richard's corporate and personal accounts. The sweet poetic justice of the moment was intoxicating. Decades ago, Cynthia had orchestrated a scene remarkably similar to this, publicly humiliating a rival socialite over a minor unpaid catering bill during a charity luncheon. She had laughed as the woman was escorted out in tears. Now Cynthia was the one on her knees listening as the club manager demanded payment for the very same party they had thrown to celebrate their stolen wealth. "You are entirely broke, Richard," Laurent snapped, leaning in close. "You have hosted a fraudulent event at my establishment. I will have the police here in 5 minutes to charge you with theft of services unless you produce a valid wire transfer right this second." Richard stood utterly paralyzed, trapped between the furious club manager and his weeping wife. The walls were rapidly closing and the illusion completely shattered. While all eyes remained completely glued to the pathetic spectacle unfolding on the stage, Sabrina attempted to quietly sneak out the side door. She was instantly blocked by a towering suited figure. The towering figure did not flinch as Sabrina collided with his broad chest. Jamal stood like an immovable monolith against the heavy oak doors, his tailored charcoal suit cutting a sharp, uncompromising silhouette in the dim lighting of the exit corridor. In his right hand, he gripped a thick manila envelope. Sabrina gasped, stumbling backward on her stilettos. Her eyes darted around, frantically searching for another escape route, but the sheer physical presence of her husband trapped her completely against the brass fixtures of the doorway. The frantic murmurs surrounding the stage abruptly died down once more. The audience, hungry for every drop of the unfolding catastrophe, immediately sensed a new focal point of destruction. Heads swiveled away from Cynthia's weeping form on the floor, and Richard's panicked confrontation with the club manager drawn by the freezing tension radiating from the side door. 500 elite guests fell completely silent, holding their collective breath as the bright spotlight of public scrutiny shifted directly onto the eldest Wilson daughter. For 5 long years, Sabrina had treated Jamal not as an equal partner, but as an exotic accessory she could parade around at country club mixers. She had continuously subjected him to calculated microaggressions, subtly belittling his background and mocking his career as a civil rights attorney. She viewed his dedication to justice as a cute hobby, simultaneously draining his bank accounts to fund her insatiable shopping habits. She had relentlessly demanded he conform to the Wilson standard of elitism, treating his genuine love as a weakness to be ruthlessly exploited. Jamal looked down at her. His expression possessed a devastating calm professionalism. There was no anger in his dark eyes, only the chilling, absolute certainty of a man who had meticulously prepared for this exact moment. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. In the dead silence of the ballroom, his rich, resonant voice carried effortlessly across the marble floors. Sabrina, Jamal stated, his tone devoid of any remaining affection. He extended his arm, pressing the heavy manila envelope firmly against her chest until her trembling hands instinctively rose to take it. Consider yourself officially served. Sabrina ripped open the flap, her perfectly manicured fingers shaking uncontrollably as she struggled with the seal. A thick stack of densely printed legal documents slid out into her hands. The first page displayed a bold, undeniable header from the State Superior Court. They were immediate divorce papers citing irreconcilable differences and egregious financial misconduct. But Jamal was not finished. He reached into his inner suit pocket and extracted a second, slightly thinner document. He held it up for the surrounding socialites to see before pressing it directly into Sabrina's trembling palm. "That first packet dissolves our marriage," Jamal explained smoothly, stepping closer so his words struck her with maximum impact. "The second packet dissolves your freedom. That is a certified copy of the criminal complaint I filed this morning with the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Sabrina let out a choked gasp, her eyes scanning the official federal seal stamped at the very top of the page. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking sickly and hollow. "You thought you were being incredibly clever," Jamal continued, exposing her treachery to the captivated room. "You thought I would not notice the secondary mortgages secretly taken out in my name. You assumed I was too busy with my practice to catch the offshore credit lines you opened using my social security number to funnel cash into your father's failing shell companies. You committed identity theft and felony credit card fraud across state lines to prop up this family's rotting facade. You used my legal reputation as your personal shield, assuming my blind loyalty would protect you from your greed." The socialites nearby gasped audibly, physically stepping back from Sabrina, as if her crimes were contagious. The revelation of federal fraud was the ultimate social death sentence in their insulated world. Sabrina frantically shook her head, tears ruining her perfectly applied mascara. She reached out, attempting to grasp his lapel in a pathetic display of manufactured vulnerability. "Jamal, please," she whimpered, her voice cracking as she begged him. "You cannot do this to me. I had to help my father. You know how much pressure he put on me. We can fix this. We can hire accountants to fix the numbers. Please, I love you." Jamal did not pull away. He simply looked down at the woman who had systematically destroyed their life together. The lack of sympathy in his rigid posture was absolute. He had reclaimed his dignity, and he was dispensing his punishment with surgical precision. "I loved you," Jamal said, his voice carrying an immense, undeniable weight that commanded the respect of every single person in the room. "But I do not love felons. My lawyer will see you in court." He took a single step aside, smoothly clearing the path to the exit. He was no longer blocking her escape because there was nowhere left for her to run. Sabrina stood trembling, clutching the federal indictment against her chest, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her sudden, irreversible downfall. The silence in the ballroom stretched out heavy and suffocating. The Wilson dynasty had been methodically dismantled in less than 20 minutes. Richard was bankrupt. Brandon was homeless and exposed. Cynthia was humiliated over unpaid debts. And Sabrina faced federal prison. The aristocratic illusion had burned to ashes. Then a new sound pierced the heavy, stagnant atmosphere. It started as a faint wail cutting through the cold night air outside the country club's grand windows. Within seconds, the sound multiplied and amplified, growing rapidly louder and more aggressive. The distinctive shriek of multiple police sirens echoed across the manicured golf course, approaching the main gates at high speed. The flashing red and blue lights reflected violently against the glass panes of the ballroom, washing over the terrified faces of my family. Someone had finally called the cops. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung wide open. 4 uniformed police officers strode directly into the room, their boots thudding against the polished marble. The wealthy crowd parted instantly. Sabrina let out a strangled gasp and shrank back against the wall, clutching her federal indictment. She squeezed her eyes shut, expecting the officers to read her Miranda rights right then and there. But the lead officer marched right past her. They marched past Richard, frozen in his standoff. They marched past Cynthia. The officers stopped directly in front of Claire. Claire blinked up at them, her face a mask of utter confusion. She was sitting in a tangled heap next to Brandon. "Claire Thorne," the lead officer stated, his voice booming through the silent room. "Stand up!" "What is this?" Brandon demanded. "You cannot just barge in here. Do you know who we are?" "They know exactly who you are, Brandon," a new voice echoed from the entrance. A man stepped through the doorway. The collective gasp that swept through the elite crowd was deafening. It was Marcus Thorne. He was also Claire's legal husband, the husband she assured Brandon she was divorcing. Marcus looked immaculate. His expression was a terrifying mask of controlled, absolute rage. I caught his eye across the vast room and offered a single nod. He nodded back, acknowledging the silent alliance we had formed 3 days ago. "Marcus!" Claire shrieked, scrambling to her feet. "Marcus! It is not what it looks like. They are lying. Audrey is lying about everything." "Save your breath, Claire," Marcus said, his voice slicing through the air. He did not yell. He did not need to. The sheer authority in his tone forced everyone to listen. "I have seen the video footage delivered directly to my secure server." Brandon staggered backward, his eyes darting between Marcus and me. He suddenly realized the true depth of the surveillance I had maintained on him. "I watched you and Brandon in the penthouse suite." Marcus continued, pacing slowly toward his wife. "I listened to the audio. I heard you detail how you were planning to drain my offshore accounts before serving me with papers. I heard you laugh about using my money to fund Brandon's ventures because his own father was too cheap to provide the cash." Claire clamped her hands over her mouth. For her entire adult life, Claire had operated on a singular parasitic strategy. She targeted wealthy, powerful men, manipulated her way into their bank accounts, and systematically drained their resources before moving on to the next host. She had played the victim perfectly. Tonight, that lifelong strategy violently backfired. Marcus snapped his fingers, mirroring the gesture I had used earlier. One of the plainclothes detectives stepped forward and handed Claire a thick stack of legal documents. "Those are the emergency court orders," Marcus announced. "Signed by a judge at 4 o'clock this afternoon. They grant me immediate and exclusive possession of the Thorne estate. You are legally barred from entering the property. Furthermore, the judge granted an emergency total freeze on all of your personal and joint assets due to documented marital fraud." "You cannot do this to me," Claire sobbed, dropping the papers. They scattered across the marble floor. "I have nothing. My credit cards, my car, my clothes." "You have the dress on your back," Marcus replied, "and a one-way ticket out of my life." Officers escort her off the premises. The 2 uniformed officers stepped forward, flanking Claire on both sides. They gripped her arms firmly. Claire thrashed and screamed, kicking her heels against the floor as they dragged her away from Brandon. She begged for mercy, her wails echoing off the chandeliers. The socialites she had desperately tried to impress watched in silent, brutal judgment as she was hauled out the front doors, her reputation and financial security completely annihilated. She was thrown onto the street in a ruined evening gown. I watched her disappear, feeling the profound satisfaction of another ledger balanced. Up in the audiovisual booth, Nolan had finished his duties. He walked down the velvet-lined stairs and took his place standing directly to my right on the stage. He held a tablet containing the digital transfers of the Vanguard assets. Richard stood near the podium, his chest heaving with erratic breaths. He looked at the empty space where Claire had just been dragged away. He looked at Brandon, who was staring blankly at the floor, realizing his promised golden kingdom was a lie, and his mistress was a fraud. He looked at Sabrina, pinned against the door by Jamal holding her federal indictment. He looked at Cynthia, still curled on the floor, weeping over her lost country club status. His legacy was gone. His family was fractured. His wealth was a complete fabrication. And I, the daughter he had spent 3 decades treating like dirt, owned every single piece of his life. Something inside Richard's brain finally snapped. The sheer, overwhelming pressure of his total failure triggered a blind, irrational rage. His face turned a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. He let out a primal roar, completely abandoning any remaining shred of dignity. He charged the stage. He did not aim for me. He aimed for Nolan, the man holding the digital proof of his ruin. Richard sprinted up the short flight of stairs, clenching his fist, throwing his entire body weight into a violent, desperate punch aimed directly at Nolan's jaw. Nolan did not flinch. With the effortless, fluid grace of a man who had anticipated the attack miles away, Nolan simply pivoted his right foot and sidestepped. Richard's momentum carried him entirely off balance. His heavy fist swung through empty air. With a sickening thud that echoed through the massive ballroom, Richard Wilson tripped over the microphone cord and face-planted onto the unforgiving hardwood stage. He lay there, groaning in pain, sprawled flat on his stomach in front of the city's most elite residents. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom burst open with a resounding crash. 4 uniformed police officers strode directly into the room, their heavy boots thudding in unison against the polished marble floor. The sea of wealthy guests parted instantly, creating a wide, terrified path. Sabrina let out a strangled gasp and shrank back against the exit door, clutching her federal indictment to her chest. She squeezed her eyes shut, her entire body shaking as she braced herself for the officers to read her Miranda rights right then and there. But the lead officer marched right past her. They marched past Richard, who was still frozen in his standoff with the furious club manager. They marched past Cynthia, who was quietly sobbing into her hands on the floor. The officers did not stop until they reached the base of the stage, standing directly in front of Claire. Claire blinked down at them, her tear-streaked face a mask of utter confusion. She was sitting in a tangled, pathetic heap next to Brandon, her silk designer gown wrinkled and stained. "Claire Thorne," the lead officer stated, his voice booming with absolute authority. "Stand up!" Brandon staggered to his feet, trying to muster a shred of his usual arrogance. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice trembling. "You cannot just barge in here. Do you know who we are?" "They know exactly who you are, Brandon." A deep, furious voice echoed from the entrance. A man stepped through the open doorway, his presence immediately dominating the room. The collective gasp that swept through the elite crowd was deafening. It was Marcus Thorne. He was a highly respected local venture capitalist, and more importantly, he was Claire's legal husband. The very same husband she had assured Brandon she was in the process of quietly divorcing. Marcus looked immaculate, but his expression was a terrifying mask of controlled, absolute rage. I caught his eye across the vast room and offered a single respectful nod. He nodded back silently, acknowledging the mutual alliance we had formed 3 days ago when I sent a highly secured encrypted file directly to his private server. "Marcus!" Claire shrieked, scrambling to her feet. "Marcus, wait! It is not what it looks like. They are lying. Audrey is lying about everything. This is a misunderstanding." "Save your breath, Claire," Marcus said, his voice slicing through the heavy air like a scythe. He did not yell. The sheer freezing authority in his tone forced every single person in the ballroom to listen. "I have seen the video footage. The crystal-clear, high-definition security footage delivered directly to my office." Brandon staggered backward, his eyes darting frantically between Marcus and me. He suddenly realized the true depth of the surveillance Vanguard Holdings had maintained on him. "I watched you and Brandon in the penthouse suite," Marcus continued, pacing slowly toward his wife like a predator cornering its prey. "I listened to the audio recordings. I heard you detail exactly how you were planning to drain my offshore accounts before serving me with papers. I heard you laugh about using my money to fund Brandon's pathetic business ventures because his own father was too cheap to provide the cash." Claire clamped her hands over her mouth, her face draining of all color. For her entire adult life, Claire had operated on a singular parasitic strategy. She targeted powerful men, manipulated her way into their bank accounts, and systematically drained their resources before moving on. She had always played the victim perfectly, leaving a trail of ruined men in her wake. Tonight, that lifelong strategy violently backfired. Marcus snapped his fingers, perfectly mirroring the gesture I had used earlier. One of the plainclothes detectives stepped forward and handed Claire a thick stack of legal documents. "Those are emergency court orders," Marcus announced, stepping back, "signed by a superior court judge at 4 o'clock this afternoon. They grant me immediate and exclusive possession of the Thorne estate. You are legally barred from entering the property. Furthermore, the judge granted an emergency freeze on all of your personal and joint assets due to documented marital fraud." "You cannot do this to me," Claire sobbed, dropping the papers. They scattered wildly across the marble floor. "I have nothing. My credit cards, my car, my clothes, my jewelry." "You have the dress on your back," Marcus replied coldly, "and a one-way ticket out of my life. Officers escort her off the premises." The two uniformed officers stepped forward, flanking Claire on both sides. They gripped her arms firmly. Claire thrashed and screamed, kicking her heels against the floor as they dragged her away from Brandon. She begged for mercy, her wails echoing off the crystal chandeliers. The socialites she had desperately tried to impress watched in silent, brutal judgment as she was hauled out the front doors, her reputation and financial security completely annihilated. She was thrown onto the street with absolutely nothing. I watched her disappear, feeling the profound satisfaction of another ledger balanced. Up in the audio-visual booth, Nolan had finished his duties. He walked down the velvet-lined stairs and took his place standing directly to my right on the stage. He held a tablet containing the digital transfers of the Vanguard assets. Richard stood near this podium, his chest heaving with erratic, panicked breaths. He looked at the empty space where Claire had just been dragged away. He looked at Brandon, who was staring blankly at the floor, realizing his promised golden kingdom was a lie, and his mistress was a fraud. He looked at Sabrina, pinned against the door by Jamal holding her federal indictment. He looked at Cynthia, still curled on the floor, weeping over her lost country club status. His legacy was gone. His family was fractured. His wealth was a complete fabrication. And I, the daughter he had spent 3 decades treating like dirt, owned every single piece of his life. Something inside Richard's brain finally snapped. The sheer, overwhelming pressure of his total failure triggered a blind, irrational rage. His face turned a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. He let out a primal roar, completely abandoning any remaining shred of dignity. He charged the stage. He did not aim for me. He aimed for Nolan, the man holding the digital proof of his ruin. Richard sprinted up the short flight of stairs, clenching his fist, throwing his entire body weight into a violent punch aimed directly at Nolan's jaw. Nolan did not flinch. With the effortless grace of a man who had anticipated the attack miles away, Nolan simply pivoted his right foot and sidestepped. Richard's momentum carried him entirely off balance. His heavy fist swung through empty air. With a sickening thud that echoed through the massive ballroom, Richard Wilson tripped over the microphone cord and face-planted onto the unforgiving hardwood stage. He lay there groaning in pain, sprawled flat on his stomach in front of the city's most elite residents. Richard lay completely motionless on the polished hardwood, his heavy, erratic breaths echoing loudly through the microphone he had just tripped over. The loud, sickening thud of his fall broke whatever hypnotic trance had kept the remaining audience rooted to their seats. The collective disgust in the room finally boiled over. The wealthy elite of the city, the very people Richard and Cynthia had spent decades desperately trying to impress, turned their backs in perfect unison. They moved toward the exits in a swift, silent exodus, unwilling to spend another second breathing the same air as the disgraced Wilson family. Designer gowns swept across the floor, completely bypassing Cynthia as she remained curled in a weeping, pathetic heap. No one offered a hand. No one offered sympathy. They simply abandoned the sinking ship, whispering feverishly to their brokers and lawyers as they rushed out the door. The lead police officer stepped over the tangled microphone cord and looked down at Richard, his hand resting casually on his heavy utility belt. He did not offer to help my father up. "Mr. Wilson," the officer stated, his tone flat and uncompromising, "consider this your one and only warning. You just attempted a physical assault in front of 500 witnesses and 4 uniformed officers. If you so much as twitch aggressively in this man's direction again, I will have you in handcuffs, and you will spend the night in a concrete cell." Richard groaned painfully, slowly, pushing himself up onto his hands and knees. Blood trickled from a small cut above his left eye, mixing with the cold sweat on his flushed, panicking face. He looked utterly pathetic. The towering, intimidating patriarch of the Wilson dynasty was permanently reduced to a crawling, broken man on an unpaid stage. Nolan calmly adjusted his tailored cuffs, entirely unbothered by the pathetic display of violence. He stepped back, giving me the space I needed. I stepped forward, standing at the edge of the stage, looking down at the 4 people who had shaped my entire existence into a grueling, daily battle for basic validation. Richard bleeding and panting, Cynthia sobbing uncontrollably into her hands, Brandon staring blankly at the wall, completely stripped of his golden future. Sabrina still pinned near the heavy oak doors, clutching her federal indictment like a shield that could no longer protect her. "Look around you," I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, devastating murmur that carried effortlessly through the now empty, echoing ballroom. "Take a very good look at what your endless, unyielding greed has bought you." Richard finally managed to lift his heavy head, his eyes burning with a toxic mixture of intense hatred and total, crushing defeat. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "You had every opportunity." I continued, ensuring each carefully chosen word landed with absolute surgical precision. "You had 33 years to just be a decent family. You did not even have to love me. You just had to treat me with the basic fundamental respect owed to a human being. But you chose this exact outcome. You chose to build an entire empire on lies, theft, and unspeakable cruelty. You chose to exploit every single person who crossed your path, including your own blood." I shifted my gaze to Brandon, who visibly flinched and refused to meet my eyes. "You wanted the crown without putting in the work, Brandon. You wanted to inherit a kingdom you did absolutely nothing to build. Now you get to inherit exactly what you earned. Absolutely nothing. Your golden boy status just expired." I turned my eyes to Sabrina across the vast room. "You thought you were untouchable, Sabrina. You thought Jamal was just a stepping stone, a prop for your social climbing. You threw away a man who genuinely loved you for the sake of designer shoes and illegal offshore accounts. Enjoy your time in federal court." Finally, I looked down at my parents, the architects of my misery. "You spent my entire life calling me a failure. You made me the designated scapegoat for every single one of your personal insecurities. You truly thought that crushing me into the dirt would keep you permanently elevated. But all you did was teach me exactly how to survive the very worst you had to offer. You forged the weapon that destroyed you. You built Vanguard Holdings by showing me exactly how not to run a business and how not to treat people." I did not wait for their pathetic excuses. I did not want their forced apologies. I turned my back on them forever, leaving their shattered reality behind. Nolan reached out his warm, steady hand, finding mine. Our fingers intertwined perfectly, a silent testament to the genuine partnership we had built together. We walked down the center aisle of the ballroom, our synchronized footsteps echoing loudly against the cold marble floor. We left Richard, Cynthia, Brandon, and Sabrina sitting in the complete wreckage of their own making. They were trapped on the floor of a massive, unpaid country club ballroom with absolutely nowhere left to run. As Nolan and I pushed through the heavy front doors and stepped out into the cool, crisp night air, a profound, undeniable physical sensation washed over my entire body. The crushing, suffocating weight of 33 years of trauma, the endless, desperate need for parental approval, the constant, paralyzing fear of rejection, it all instantly evaporated into the dark sky. My lungs expanded fully for the first time in my life. I stood taller. I breathed deeper. I was finally completely free from the toxic gravitational pull of the Wilson family. We walked toward the waiting car, leaving the blazing artificial lights of the Platinum Country Club behind us. The police sirens had faded away, replaced by the quiet, peaceful hum of the sleeping city. The great Wilson Empire was nothing but a pile of smoldering, toxic ashes. But as the heavy dust settles over the total destruction of my family's stolen legacy, a brand new chapter is already waiting to be written. The immediate vengeance is complete. The financial debts are